Calculations are one of the most popular and powerful parts of the FileMaker platform. If I open a FileMaker custom application and I go to Manage Database, I can bring up the list of fields that are in a table and I can add a new field. Now the field types, of course, could be text, number, date, time, things like that. But the calculation field right here, when you set this up, is the first time most people see the calculation engine. Now, in the early days of the FileMaker platform, the calculation engine was limited just to the calculation field. But as time has gone on over the last number of years, every time a new feature comes out in the FileMaker platform, developers want to control it or manage it by using the calculation engine. So in previous videos, we've talked about the calculation engine and how you can pop open the calculation, and we're looking at the calculation workspace. The calculation engine can perform all sorts of basic or advanced mathematical functions, as well as perform basic or advanced text analysis or formatting of text. The calculation engine can create paragraphs of text and can even concatenate the text together. It can analyze the data that users are inputting into fields. It also can make decisions on output based upon the results within the calculation. Here on the left, we can see the fields that we have access to here. Of course, you can access different tables here by selecting the different table occurrences up here above. In this column on the right side, we have operators. You can think of operators as like mathematical operators where you can add, multiply, and things like that. But operators also allow you to add or concatenate multiple pieces of text together. For example, you can see that in this formula right here. Let me go ahead and simplify it. So in this calculation, we have first name, a space, and last name. Well, the first name is a field, and then the ampersand allows us to append another string or another function on the end. So we actually have three elements here. We have the first element here, an ampersand, the second element here, an ampersand, and the last element. It's pretty straightforward. That's a fundamental requirement because we're actually putting in three separate sources of text. Now the output right here should be text. Of course, in other demonstrations, sometimes we have number fields, etc. But in this case, we definitely have text, so we want to make sure we specify that. So back to the top, we have this quote right here. And that quote is just a space. It's a literal piece of text. I could type, "The dog jumped over the moon," and that would be just as valid as anything else. What if I take the quotes off? Well, then FileMaker is going to think that's the name of a field or a function. And of course, it will look for "the dog jumped over the moon" field or function, and it won't be able to find it. And we would get an error if we tried to exit this screen. So moving along to the right side, we have a list of functions. FileMaker by default comes with a huge list of built-in functions. And frankly, I don't know anyone who has all these memorized. The list is just a huge list, and it's always growing with new sorts of functions and capabilities that come out with new versions of FileMaker. I normally leave the function list sorted by name, and that's generally pretty helpful. In fact, normally what happens when I'm writing a calculation is on the left side, I can easily identify the fields that I want to work on because obviously I'm on a layout and I'm kind of working out what needs to happen. And then of course the operators are pretty straightforward because those are pretty basic, pretty consistent with math that most people learned in grade school. And then of course on the right side, I have a general idea of the kind of function that I want to run. If it's a very, very common function, then I might have the exact name memorized. But if it's one that I don't use all the time, then I'll probably have to put in a search up here to help narrow the list down. What you're going to find is that senior developers use FileMaker a lot, and they have a general sense of the functions that are in there. Now, of course, I find all the time that some developers have forgotten about certain little obscure functions that do something fairly specific. But most developers have a general sense of what all the functions are, even if they can't name them. They understand that they can find out the active objects on a layout, or all the objects on a layout, or the coordinates of where the user is at, or maybe the username, or any feature of hundreds of different functions. Once again, my goal is to memorize the common ones and then have a general sense of what the functions can do. So then I know if I'm looking for something, I have a general idea of where to go. So say, for example, I'm aware that there's a function that will have FileMaker take an image and resize the image for me. And in this specific case, FileMaker Incorporated has mislabeled this function a little bit. It's actually called getThumbnail. It's right here. So this is a good example of a function that I might not have exactly memorized, but I know that there's this general capability to resize an image. And in fact, that's what this function does. It doesn't actually make a thumbnail in so much as it actually will resize an image. It'll take a large image and change the size to a different dimension. Now, most people will use it to make a thumbnail, but there's no requirement that the image has to be a specific size. Now, this is a function that I use probably once or twice a year, and I will frequently forget the exact spelling of it, but I know that the word thumb is in there somewhere. So if I type thumb in the search box, then the list is narrowed down appropriately and I can find what I'm looking for. Now, there are some functions in here that we use all the time. In my specific situation, I use the if statement, seems like every other day. So of course, the if statement is basically, if something happens, then do this. And if it didn't happen, then do this other thing. Now, the if statement we also see in our scripting or script workspace as a script step that we can call. In fact, we cover that in detail in other videos. But mechanically, it works the same way. Another function that I use all the time is isEmpty, right here. It's very handy because basically what it will tell you is if a field is empty. Now, there's two ways of using isEmpty here. First, you can put isEmpty over here like this. You can specify a field which might be empty, and the calculation will activate result 1 if this is true. Result 1 is the positive or true result. Now, if it's not empty, which implies it has something in it or it's full, then result 2 will be used instead. Result number 2 is the false or negative result. Now, if you've been watching my videos for any period of time, you probably noticed that I spend a lot of time training people and trying to keep the conversations as simple as possible. I try to write things in a positive fashion. So for example, if a field equals this, then do this, right? If a dog is hungry, then feed it. And of course, this makes sense. However, in this situation here, we have this isEmpty function. So if a container is empty, then do this. However, it might not be empty, which actually means it has content in it. Then we actually have to take action based upon a negative or false statement. But for the most part, I prefer to actually write things in a positive, straightforward method. So I would prefer to test for a positive condition. However, there is no command to test for a field is full. So because there's no custom function to test if a field has content in it, we actually have to have a double negative. The workaround is to basically say, if it's not isEmpty. Not isEmpty, in my mind, is kind of a double negative, which does mean it's full or partially full. Moving forward, if you play with the calculation, you'll start to figure this and other things out. In fact, as you start to play with the calculation engine, you're going to discover tons of little tips and tricks that will save you time. Of course, you could read about tips and tricks online in someone's blog because it seems like every week someone discovers something new they can do inside the calculation engine. Now, if we look at the function list again on the right side, it's important to point out that there are a tremendous number of get functions. Get functions typically will talk to FileMaker or FileMaker server or cloud and bring back some little bit of data. At the most basic level, a get function will come back with the current date. So FileMaker actually goes to the computer, talks to the operating system, and brings back the current date. Of course, it can bring back the current time. It can bring back the type of computer you're on, the size of screen you're using, the number of people connected to the server. It can come back with a million different things. Frankly, the get functions are really, really cool. Now let's cover a couple other things about the calculation engine. While we've talked about text and number as common outputs for the calculation, your output could be a date or to a lesser degree a time or timestamp. And of course that makes sense. You could do some math and come out with a specific time. You could take the current time right now and add 60 minutes to it. That would come out as a different time, a future time. Now there is also a container, which is an interesting option. Normally within text you can formulate and create text. Of course, you could do math and come up with a mathematical number. But you really can't create a container within a calculation or somehow alter the container. Now, you saw, of course, that we did have the thumbnail resize function, which was very cool, and that's pretty much it. For the most part with a container, you're not going to do much in terms of a calculation, other than maybe evaluating the metadata under the hood of the calculation. But even the metadata, which is text and information about the image or the container item, well, that's just text. So if you're playing with that, that would come out as text. So even that's not a container. Really what it comes down to is that generally you're going to output as a container if you have a function that somehow references another container, or if you start to do some really deep programming with things like base64. Base64 is a function that takes text and translates it into an image. It's actually pretty cool stuff, and it's really beyond this beginning video. However, my general point is that you're going to have very few opportunities to output a calculation as a container field.